The call came through to the Cornelius Police Department just after 11 p.m. on September 23, 2018. A woman had collapsed at home. Her husband, a paramedic, was performing CPR, but by the time first responders arrived at the upscale North Carolina residence, 32-year-old Stacy Hunsucker was already gone. For Joshua Hunsucker, a respected paramedic and volunteer firefighter, it should have been a routine tragedy. Sudden cardiac death, a medical examiner would note, likely from a heart condition. A young mother of two, dead too soon. The community mourned. The insurance company paid out. Life, as they say, went on. But Stacy Hunsucker's mother smelled something rotten, and what she suspected would unravel one of the most calculating, bizarre murders in North Carolina history. A killing method so unusual that investigators initially refused to believe it was even possible. Joshua Lee Hunsucker seemed to have it all figured out. Standing just over 6 feet tall with an athletic build, the 35-year-old paramedic had spent his entire adult life in emergency services. He worked for Mecklenburg EMS, one of the busiest emergency medical systems in North Carolina, responding to heart attacks, car crashes, and overdoses across Charlotte and its suburbs. His colleagues knew him as competent, if somewhat cocky, the kind of guy who always had an answer, always knew the right protocol, always seemed in control. On the side, Hunsucker volunteered with the Cornelius Lemley Fire Department, adding to his image as a community servant. He and Stacy had built what appeared to be an enviable life in the Lake Norman area, an affluent region north of Charlotte known for its waterfront properties and young families. They had 2 children, and from the outside, the Hunsuckers looked like any other successful suburban couple navigating the chaos of parenthood while building their future. But those closest to Stacy had begun noticing cracks in the facade. In the months before her death, Stacy Hunsucker had been experiencing strange symptoms. She complained of feeling dizzy, of her heart racing without explanation. She was tired all the time, more than the usual exhaustion that comes with raising 2 small children. Friends noticed she seemed off, not quite herself. But she was young and otherwise healthy, no history of heart problems, no obvious red flags that would explain the way she felt. Stacy confided in her mother, Susie Robinson, that something wasn't right. She couldn't put her finger on it, but her body was betraying her in ways she couldn't understand. Several times in those final months, she'd felt so ill that she wondered if she needed to see a doctor. But with 2 kids and a busy household to manage, she kept pushing through, attributing her symptoms to stress and exhaustion. Joshua, with all his medical training, should have been concerned. Instead, according to later testimony from family members, he seemed dismissive of his wife's complaints. What Stacy didn't know, what nobody knew, was that her husband had a secret that would have explained everything she was feeling. And that secret was about to kill her. September 23, 2018, started like any other Sunday. The Hunsuckers went about their routine with the kids. Evening came, and then, without warning, Stacy collapsed. Joshua immediately called 911, identifying himself as a paramedic and stating that his wife was in cardiac arrest. He began CPR, going through the motions he'd performed hundreds of times in his career. When paramedics, his own colleagues, arrived at the scene, they found Joshua working on Stacy, but it was clear she was beyond saving. Despite aggressive resuscitation efforts, Stacy Hunsucker was pronounced dead. For the responding paramedics and police, there was little reason for suspicion. Joshua was one of them, a trained medical professional who had done everything right. His wife had simply died. Tragic, yes, but not necessarily suspicious. She was young, but young people sometimes have undiagnosed heart conditions. It happens. At the hospital, the initial assessment pointed towards sudden cardiac death. An autopsy would be performed, standard procedure for any unexpected death, but there was no obvious sign of foul play. No trauma, no violence, no struggle. Joshua played the part of the devastated widower. He made funeral arrangements. He accepted condolences from the community, and he waited for the insurance payout that would soon be coming his way. A payout that would raise the first real questions about what had actually happened that night. Susie Robinson had never trusted Joshua Hunsucker. From early in her daughter's marriage, something about her son-in-law had bothered her, though she couldn't always articulate what it was. He was controlling, she thought. There was a coldness beneath his professional exterior, and in the wake of Stacy's death, his behavior struck her as wrong. He didn't seem devastated enough. He moved on too quickly. And when Susie learned about the life insurance policies, totaling $250,000, she felt her suspicions crystallize into certainty. In the days following Stacy's funeral, Susie Robinson made a decision that would change everything. She contacted Mecklenburg EMS, Joshua's employer, and told them point blank. She believed Joshua had murdered her daughter. She demanded that they investigate. Her accusation was explosive, but more than that, it was specific. Susie told investigators that she believed Joshua had been poisoning Stacy, though with what she couldn't say. She just knew in her gut that her daughter's death wasn't natural. For the detectives who would eventually take up the case, Susie's insistence presented a problem. The autopsy had been completed, and the medical examiner had found no obvious cause of death beyond cardiac arrest. There was no poison detected in routine toxicology screening, no physical evidence of murder, just a mother's intuition and an insurance policy that, while substantial, wasn't so unusual for a family with young children. But Susie wouldn't let it go, and her persistence would force investigators to look closer at a death they'd almost written off as natural. Detective Scott Ballard of the Cornelius Police Department was assigned to follow up on Susie Robinson's complaint. A veteran investigator with decades of experience, Ballard had seen his share of suspicious deaths, but this case puzzled him from the start. Everything about Stacy Hunsucker's death looked natural. The autopsy revealed a heart that had simply stopped. No drugs in her system beyond normal therapeutic levels, no signs of trauma or struggle. But Ballard had learned to trust a mother's instinct, and when he started digging into the Hunsuckers' financial situation, he discovered something that made him sit up and take notice. Just months before Stacy's death, Joshua had taken out a new life insurance policy on his wife. Combined with an existing policy, the total death benefit was $250,000, payable to Joshua as the sole beneficiary. The timing was suspicious, but not necessarily criminal. People take out insurance policies all the time. It's prudent, especially for parents of young children. What caught Ballard's attention was Joshua's behavior after Stacy's death. Within weeks, before his wife's body was even cold, Joshua had begun the process of claiming the insurance money. He seemed eager, almost impatient, to collect. There was no period of mourning, no hesitation, just a businessman executing a transaction. Ballard requested the full autopsy report and began interviewing family members, friends, and colleagues. A picture began to emerge of a marriage that wasn't as perfect as it appeared. Several people mentioned that Stacy had been feeling unwell in the months before her death. She'd complained of dizziness, nausea, and heart palpitations. At the time, everyone assumed she was just stressed or possibly coming down with something. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and a suspicious death, those symptoms took on a sinister new meaning. Ballard's investigation might have stalled, if not for an unusual piece of evidence that emerged from the autopsy. The medical examiner had preserved blood and tissue samples from Stacy's body, standard procedure in any unexplained death. These samples had been subjected to routine toxicology screening, which had come back negative for common poisons, illegal drugs, and prescription medications at toxic levels. But routine screening doesn't test for everything. There are thousands of substances that could harm or kill a person, and toxicologists can't test for all of them without specific direction. They need to know what they're looking for. Ballard began researching poisons that could cause cardiac arrest in a young, healthy woman, poisons that might not show up on standard toxicology screens. He consulted with medical examiners and toxicologists, asking a simple question: what could kill someone and mimic natural heart failure? One answer kept coming up: tetrahydrozoline. Most people have never heard of tetrahydrozoline, but they've almost certainly used it. It's the active ingredient in over-the-counter eye drops, like Visine and nasal decongestants. In small doses applied topically to the eyes or nose, it's perfectly safe. It works by constricting blood vessels, reducing redness and swelling. But when ingested orally, especially in larger quantities, tetrahydrozoline becomes something else entirely: a deadly poison. The chemical is an alpha-2 adrenergic agonist, which means it affects the central nervous system in profound ways. In toxic doses, it can cause severe drops in blood pressure, decreased heart rate, respiratory depression, and complete cardiovascular collapse. The symptoms, dizziness, nausea, irregular heartbeat, were exactly what Stacy had been experiencing in her final months. Even more importantly for a would-be murderer, tetrahydrozoline doesn't show up on standard toxicology screens. You have to specifically test for it. Without reason to suspect poisoning by eye drops, no medical examiner would think to look for it. Ballard had found his lead. Now he needed proof. Convincing a judge to order the exhumation of Stacy Hunsucker's body was no easy task. Ballard needed to show probable cause that a crime had been committed, but his evidence was largely circumstantial. A suspicious insurance payout, a grieving mother's accusation, and a theory about poison that hadn't been tested for during the original autopsy. But Ballard was persistent. He presented the judge with everything he had: the timeline of Joshua taking out new insurance policies shortly before Stacy's death, witness statements about Stacy's mysterious illness in the months before she died, Joshua's suspicious behavior after her death, and the medical literature on tetrahydrozoline poisoning. In December 2019, more than a year after Stacy's death, a judge signed the order. Stacy Hunsucker's body would be exhumed, and her tissues would be subjected to specific testing for tetrahydrozoline. The exhumation took place on a cold winter morning. Forensic investigators carefully removed Stacy's remains and transported them to the medical examiner's office. New samples were taken and sent to a specialized toxicology laboratory capable of detecting tetrahydrozoline at minute concentrations. Then came the waiting. Testing for unusual substances takes time, often weeks or months. Ballard continued his investigation, building a timeline of Joshua's activities in the months before and after Stacy's death. He interviewed Joshua's colleagues at the EMS department, asking if Joshua had ever discussed eye drops or shown unusual interest in toxicology. He examined the Hunsuckers' credit card records and pharmacy purchases, looking for evidence that Joshua had bought large quantities of eye drops. Meanwhile, Joshua Hunsucker continued his life. He was still working as a paramedic, still responding to emergencies, still trusted with people's lives. He had no idea that investigators were closing in. In early 2020, the results came back from the lab. The news was stunning. Stacy Hunsucker's blood and tissue samples contained massive levels of tetrahydrozoline, levels consistent with deliberate poisoning, not accidental ingestion. The concentration was so high that there was no question this was intentional. Stacy hadn't accidentally ingested a few drops of Visine. She had been systematically poisoned over a period of time with lethal doses of the chemical. For Detective Ballard, the toxicology report was the smoking gun he'd been searching for. Stacy's death was now officially a homicide, but proving that Joshua was the one who administered the poison would require more work. Ballard intensified his investigation, now with the full weight of a murder inquiry behind him. He obtained search warrants for Joshua's home, vehicle, and workplace locker. Forensic teams descended on the Hunsucker residence, looking for any evidence of tetrahydrozoline, empty eye drop bottles, credit card receipts, online purchase records. What they found was telling. In Joshua's possession, investigators discovered multiple bottles of eye drops, far more than any one person would need for legitimate use. Credit card records showed Joshua had purchased eye drops repeatedly in the months before Stacy's death, sometimes buying multiple bottles at a time from different stores. Even more damning, investigators found evidence that Joshua had been researching tetrahydrozoline online. His search history included queries about the chemical's effects, its toxicity, and whether it could be detected in an autopsy. He had visited forums and websites discussing unusual poisons. He had read articles about other cases where people had been poisoned with eye drops. Joshua Hunsucker hadn't just murdered his wife. He had researched exactly how to do it and how to get away with it. On December 19, 2019, more than a year after Stacy's death, Detective Ballard obtained an arrest warrant for Joshua Lee Hunsucker. The charge, first-degree murder. Ballard and his team arrested Joshua at his home. According to police reports, Joshua showed little emotion when informed he was being charged with killing his wife. He invoked his right to remain silent and requested an attorney. He was taken to the Mecklenburg County Jail, where bail was set at $1.5 million. News of the arrest shocked the Lake Norman community. Joshua Hunsucker, the respected paramedic and firefighter, was accused of one of the most calculated murders anyone could imagine, slowly poisoning his wife to collect insurance money. But as shocking as the arrest was, what investigators were learning about Joshua's behavior in the months after Stacy's death was even more disturbing. While publicly playing the grieving widower, Joshua had been living a very different life in private. As detectives dug deeper into Joshua's background, a picture emerged of a man who was nothing like his public persona. While Stacy was still alive, Joshua had been living a secret life, one filled with financial schemes, extramarital affairs, and a callous disregard for everyone around him. Financial records revealed that Joshua was drowning in debt. Despite his steady income as a paramedic, he had accumulated tens of thousands of dollars in credit card bills, personal loans, and other obligations. The $250,000 insurance payout wasn't just a windfall. It was a financial lifeline he desperately needed. Even more disturbing, investigators discovered that Joshua had been having multiple affairs during his marriage to Stacy. He'd been using dating apps and websites to meet women, often while Stacy was home with their children. Some of these relationships had been ongoing for months. The women he'd been seeing had no idea he was married. In the weeks after Stacy's death, while he was supposedly mourning, Joshua had continued these relationships. Text messages recovered from his phone showed him making plans to meet women, discussing future vacations, and never once mentioning that his wife had just died. This was not a man who had lost the love of his life. This was a man who had eliminated an obstacle and was ready to move on. Friends and family members who had attended Stacy's funeral, who had consoled Joshua and supported him, were sickened when they learned the truth. The man they'd pitied was a monster who had methodically poisoned his wife, while she begged him for help understanding why she felt so ill. With Joshua in custody, prosecutors in Mecklenburg County began building their case for trial. The charge was first-degree murder, which in North Carolina carries a potential sentence of life in prison without parole or death. The prosecution's case rested on several pillars of evidence. First, the toxicology report showing lethal levels of tetrahydrozoline in Stacy's system. Expert witnesses would testify that the concentration found in her body could only have resulted from intentional, repeated poisoning over an extended period. Second, the physical evidence, the multiple bottles of eye drops found in Joshua's possession, the credit card receipts showing his purchases, and the search history on his devices demonstrating his research into the poison and its effects. Third, the circumstantial evidence of motive, the crushing debt, the new insurance policies taken out shortly before Stacy's death, and Joshua's almost immediate attempts to collect the money. Fourth, witness testimony from Stacy's friends and family about her mysterious illness in the months before her death, symptoms perfectly consistent with tetrahydrozoline poisoning. And finally, evidence of Joshua's behavior after Stacy's death, the affairs, the lack of genuine grief, the eagerness to move on. But the defense had arguments of their own to make. Joshua's attorney, David Teddy, faced an uphill battle. The evidence against his client was substantial, and public opinion had already convicted Joshua in the court of popular media. But Teddy was an experienced criminal defense attorney, and he began poking holes in the prosecution's case. The defense's primary argument was that while tetrahydrozoline had indeed been found in Stacy's body, there was no direct evidence that Joshua had administered it. The eye drops found in his home and car could be explained as legitimate purchases for personal use. The search history could be explained as general medical curiosity. After all, Joshua was a paramedic with professional interest in toxicology and emergency medicine. Teddy argued that the prosecution's case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. Yes, Joshua had financial problems. Yes, he'd taken out insurance on Stacy, but none of that proved he'd poisoned her. The defense suggested alternative explanations. Could Stacy have accidentally ingested tetrahydrozoline herself? Could she have been using eye drops excessively for some reason and accidentally poisoned herself? The defense also attacked the timeline, pointing out that there was no precise evidence about when the poisoning had occurred or how many doses Stacy had received. Without witnesses to the actual poisoning, without video evidence or a confession, how could the jury be certain, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Joshua was responsible? As jury selection began in late 2021, both sides knew this would be a battle fought over medical evidence, expert testimony, and the jury's willingness to convict based on circumstantial evidence, no matter how damning that evidence appeared. The trial of Joshua Hunsucker began in Mecklenburg County Superior Court with intense media scrutiny. The case had captured national attention. The paramedic husband who allegedly used his medical knowledge to commit the perfect murder, undone only by a mother's persistent suspicion and a detective's thorough investigation. In opening statements, prosecutor Angela Fonseca painted a picture of a cold, calculating killer who had researched his method carefully, executed it over months, and then tried to profit from his crime. She walked the jury through the evidence methodically, the insurance policies, the purchases of eye drops, the internet searches, the toxicology results. Joshua Hunsucker is a paramedic, Fonseca told the jury. Guys here, he knows exactly how the human body works. He knows what happens when someone ingests large amounts of tetrahydrozoline, and he used that knowledge to slowly poison his wife while she begged him to help her understand why she felt so sick. This is not just murder. This is betrayal of the deepest kind. The defense's opening was more restrained. David Teddy acknowledged that Stacy's death was tragic and that tetrahydrozoline had been found in her system. But he urged the jury to remember the standard of proof required for conviction, beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution wants you to believe they know what happened in the Hunsucker home, Teddy said. But the truth is, they're asking you to speculate. They're asking you to assume. They have no witnesses to this alleged poisoning, no video evidence, no confession, just a theory based on circumstantial evidence. The battle lines were drawn. The prosecution's case began with medical testimony. Dr. James Wilkerson, the forensic pathologist who had supervised the toxicology testing, took the stand to explain the science behind tetrahydrozoline poisoning. Under questioning from the prosecution, Wilkerson explained that tetrahydrozoline is found in many common over-the-counter products, but that ingestion of the substance, particularly in large quantities, can be fatal. He walked the jury through how the chemical affects the body, constricting blood vessels, lowering blood pressure, slowing the heart rate, and ultimately causing cardiovascular collapse. Most importantly, Wilkerson testified about the levels found in Stacy's body. The concentration of tetrahydrozoline in Mrs. Hunsucker's blood and tissue samples was extraordinarily high, he said. This was not accidental ingestion. This was not someone who took a sip of eye drops by mistake. The levels we found are consistent with repeated, intentional poisoning over an extended period of time. On cross-examination, the defense tried to shake Wilkerson's certainty. Could the testing have been wrong? Could the samples have been contaminated? Could there be any other explanation for the levels found? Wilkerson was unshakable. The testing had been done by one of the country's leading toxicology labs, using the most advanced methods available. The results had been confirmed through multiple tests. There was no question about the presence of tetrahydrozoline, or the fact that it was at lethal concentrations. The prosecution then called additional medical experts to testify about Stacy's symptoms in the months before her death. A cardiologist explained that the dizziness, heart palpitations, and nausea Stacy had experienced were classic symptoms of tetrahydrozoline poisoning, not heart disease or any other natural cause. Perhaps the most damaging testimony came when prosecutors presented evidence from Joshua's electronic devices. A forensic computer analyst walked the jury through Joshua's search history in the months before and after Stacy's death. The searches painted a chilling picture of a man planning and executing a murder. Joshua had searched for tetrahydrozoline poisoning. Can eye drops kill you? Heart attack symptoms, and how long does it take for poison to leave the body? He'd visited websites discussing famous poisoning cases and had read medical journals about undetectable poisons. Even more disturbing were searches conducted after Stacy's death. Can autopsy detect eye drop poison? Insurance investigation process, and how long before insurance pays out? The prosecution argued this was clear evidence of premeditation and consciousness of guilt. Joshua hadn't just poisoned his wife. He'd researched how to do it, monitored whether he would be caught, and planned for the financial aftermath. The defense tried to contextualize these searches as professional curiosity from a paramedic who dealt with medical emergencies daily. But to the jury, watching the search terms flash on screens in the courtroom, the intent seemed clear and sinister. Prosecutors spent significant time establishing Joshua's financial motive for murder. Forensic accountants testified about Joshua's dire financial situation, the mounting debts, the maxed-out credit cards, the loans he was struggling to repay. They showed that in the months before Stacy's death, Joshua had taken out a new $200,000 life insurance policy on his wife, adding to an existing $50,000 policy. The timing was crucial. Just 6 months before Stacy died, Joshua had ensured that her death would be worth $250,000 to him. Bank records showed that within weeks of Stacy's death, Joshua had contacted the insurance companies to begin the claims process. He'd filled out paperwork, submitted death certificates, and followed up repeatedly about when the money would be paid out. For a supposedly grieving husband, he seemed remarkably focused on the financial aspects of his wife's death. The prosecution also presented evidence that Joshua had continued living well beyond his means, even after Stacy's death, racking up charges for expensive dinners, entertainment, and gifts for women he was dating, all while waiting for the insurance payout that he clearly believed was coming. Some of the most emotional testimony came from Stacy's family and friends. Susie Robinson took the stand to describe her daughter's final months, the mysterious illness, the complaints of feeling unwell, and the horrifying realization after Stacy's death that her son-in-law might be responsible. "Stacy called me several times in those last months," Susie testified, tears streaming down her face. She said she felt terrible, that her heart was racing, that she was dizzy all the time. She asked Joshua what was wrong with her, and he told her it was stress, that she needed to relax, all while he was poisoning her. Friends testified about changes they'd noticed in Stacy's appearance and demeanor. She'd lost weight. She seemed exhausted and unwell. Multiple people had asked if she was seeing a doctor, and Stacy had responded that Joshua, with his medical training, said she was fine. The most chilling testimony came from one of Stacy's close friends, who recounted a conversation they'd had just weeks before Stacy's death. "She told me she felt like she was dying," the friend said. "Those were her exact words. I feel like I'm dying. And I told her to go to the hospital to get checked out, but she said Joshua told her she was fine, that it was just anxiety. She trusted him. He was her husband and a paramedic. Why wouldn't she trust him?" The defense tried to suggest that Stacy's symptoms could have been caused by any number of factors: stress, an undiagnosed medical condition, even hypochondria. But the prosecution tied each symptom directly back to the toxicology report. Everything Stacy felt was explained by slow poisoning with tetrahydrozoline. Throughout the trial, Joshua Hunsucker remained largely expressionless. He sat at the defense table in business casual clothing, occasionally taking notes, but showing little emotion as witness after witness described his wife's death and his alleged role in causing it. The defense chose not to put Joshua on the stand. It was a calculated decision. Joshua would have faced withering cross-examination about his financial situation, his affairs, his internet searches, and his behavior after Stacy's death. The risk of him making a mistake or coming across as cold and unfeeling was too great. Instead, the defense strategy focused on attacking the prosecution's evidence and creating reasonable doubt. They called their own expert witnesses to suggest that the toxicology results, while concerning, didn't definitively prove that Joshua had administered the poison. They argued that there were gaps in the investigation: no witnesses to the actual poisoning, no physical evidence of Joshua forcing Stacy to ingest anything. The defense also tried to humanize Joshua, calling character witnesses who testified about his dedication as a paramedic, his volunteer work with the fire department, and his role as a father. But these testimonials rang hollow against the mountain of evidence suggesting he had systematically murdered his wife for money. After weeks of testimony, the trial moved to closing arguments. The prosecution went first, and Angela Fonseca delivered a methodical, devastating summary of the evidence. She reminded the jury of the toxicology report, the undeniable proof that Stacy had been poisoned with lethal levels of tetrahydrozoline. She walked them through Joshua's purchases of eye drops, his internet searches about poisoning and detection, and his desperate financial situation. She recounted Stacy's symptoms in her final months, symptoms that matched tetrahydrozoline poisoning perfectly. "Joshua Hunsucker is a paramedic," Fonseca said. "He saves lives for a living. But he used that same knowledge to take a life, his wife's life. He knew exactly what he was doing. He researched it, he planned it, he executed it, and then he tried to profit from it." She pointed to the insurance policies, the rapid attempts to collect the money, and Joshua's behavior in the weeks after Stacy's death. "This is not the behavior of a grieving husband. This is the behavior of a man who got what he wanted." The defense's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt. David Teddy acknowledged that the evidence was troubling, but insisted that troubling evidence wasn't the same as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Yes, Joshua had financial problems. Many people have financial problems. That doesn't make them murderers, Teddy argued. Yes, he had insurance policies on his wife. Many couples have insurance policies on each other. That's responsible planning, not evidence of murder. He attacked the lack of direct evidence: no witnesses, no video, no confession. The prosecution wants you to fill in the blanks with speculation. But that's not how our justice system works. If you have doubt, reasonable doubt, about whether Joshua administered this poison, you must find him not guilty. It was a valiant effort, but both sides knew the evidence had been overwhelming. After receiving their instructions from the judge, the jury retired to deliberate. The wait was agonizing for everyone involved. Stacy's family, hoping for justice, Joshua's supporters, holding out hope for acquittal, and the community, watching to see if a paramedic would be convicted of using his medical knowledge to commit murder. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The forewoman stood and handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge reviewed it silently, his face impassive, then handed it back to be read aloud. In the matter of the state of North Carolina versus Joshua Lee Hunsucker, on the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Stacy's mother collapsed in tears, surrounded by family members. Joshua showed emotion for the first time during the trial, his face falling as the weight of the verdict hit him. His attorneys immediately moved for a mistrial, but the judge denied the motion. Joshua Lee Hunsucker had been convicted of murdering his wife by poisoning her with eye drops. The Boy Scout paramedic, the respected first responder, the man trusted to save lives, had been exposed as a cold-blooded killer who had slowly murdered the mother of his children for insurance money. As bailiffs led Joshua from the courtroom in handcuffs, Susie Robinson spoke to reporters on the courthouse steps. Stacy trusted him, she said, her voice breaking. She loved him. She asked him for help when she felt sick, and all along he was the one making her sick. But now there's justice. Finally, there's justice for my daughter. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, where Joshua would face the possibility of life in prison without parole for his calculated, methodical murder of Stacy Hunsucker.